Made IT manager look bad in job interview, by mistake. I was in an interview at a small local meat processing plant, for a job as an IT tech. I would be reporting to the IT manager, their only IT guy, who was sitting in on the interview being conducted by the accountant. I was confident I could easily do the job, since it was simply a bunch of networked PCs throughout the plant. Stuff like PC stations at various points along the processing line, to scan/enter progress of the meat at various points of the processing. Since my answers to their questions are all very satisfactory, the manager asked me, in the case of a computer going down e.g. dead hard drive, how I would go about fixing it quickly to make sure the processing line is not down any longer than necessary. Apparently, due to regulations, the meat can't proceed to the next station until it is scanned at that something like the whole line will be halted in the interim. I suggested that I would simply keep a couple of spare PCs on standby with the software installed and ready to go, so that you can easily swap it out with the faulty one and get the line back operational in 2 minutes. Then take the faulty one away and fix it at your leisure. Now, this is not exactly genius stuff, but the look on the accountant's face was one of amazement. He sat there with his mouth open. Then after a few seconds he glances at the IT manager, who looked at him with embarrassment. Then he turned back to his notes and started scribbling furiously, LOL. Obviously this is some kind of revelation to them. With a puzzled look on my face, I asked, how do you guys handle that situation at the moment? The topic was quickly changed. I tried my best to suppress a cheeky grin. P.S. I was called back for a second interview, but declined at the time, for many reasons. 1. I'd be reporting to a guy, and getting paid less than a guy, who was less competent than myself. 2. I didn't like the pay or conditions of employment they were offering, which I only found out about in that interview. I always ask more questions than the interviewer, because I need to know if they are a right fit for diligence. I imagine being in a meat processing facility is tough on hardware. Lots of cold damp spaces, plus the actual meat. Did IT work at a pork processor and on the hot side, aka the killing floor? Things were mostly okay as long as the seals held on the boxes. But for some reason on the cold side where the fine cuts and packing was done, the machines had to be swapped every couple months at least. I think the cold interacted with the cleaners they used to spray everything down and made it way more corrosive or something. The same cleaners were used on both sides as far as I know. I've heard that viruses spread easily among meat workers, in part due to standing close together, but also because humid air allows them to survive longer in the air. It's probably the humidity causing components to die faster. In my biology lab, it's obvious which pieces of equipment have spent a long time sitting in the cold room. 4C. Cold also lends itself to things like condensation. Technically only when the temperature changes, but on a small scale it does that inside the PC as it's doing more or less work. All you have to do is put it in a plexiglass case surrounding the pole with the input jacks, and use wireless mouse/keyboard. We had that set up in a steel casting facility where carbon dust was rampant. If it's just a scanning station, use a Pi or something too. Meant to be sealed in a box, cheap. If the software they have support running on a Pi. If it doesn't, have the Pi run it off of a server through Citrix or something similar. Not exactly rocket surgery. The funnier part isn't that the manager hadn't bought spare systems. It's that the person scribbling notes was the accountant. In almost every other situation it'd be the accounting department that would be preventing the spare computers. An extra $5,000 to your budget to have computers doing nothing? Unacceptable. The accountant knows the cost of downtime. Likely the frequency of the downtime too. Good accountants know the risk-reward calculations. It's a very particular question, suggesting they may have recently had an outage and it cost a lot more than a few spares would. I'll agree with the last statement about a recent outage maybe had the cost in the forefront of their mind. However, in my experience the bean counters know the cost of a downtime but don't believe the cost to be ready for it can't be cheaper. Hard drive failure. Sounds like we need a spare hard drive, not a complete spare computer. I had a hospital where all of the systems were run on hardware that was end of life longer than it was under support. Replacement was cut from the budget every year and replaced with a line item for replacement drives. Cost of system failure was literally a complete business shutdown until recovery could be confirmed, which meant waiting to source hardware. Rebuild of every system. And review/catch up. It can be really hard to convince the decision makers to make the spend. An accountant though is easier to convince than a CLAO because they're comfortable with the math. Of course, the accountant doesn't get to make that call, because downtime losses don't go under the same GL as measures to prevent it. I used to be a truck driver for a logistics company working for a notoriously cheap pub chain. Most firms change their trucks every 3 to 5 years. We had a whole new fleet which coincided with London starting to charge trucks that didn't meet certain emission standards massive fines for going in. So 4 years later we were discussing the replacement of these vehicles, and when our transport manager went to the customer to find out the budget, their response was, "Why do you need new trucks? You only had new ones a few years ago and they haven't changed the les again." I had a similar customer, but I think they spent a lot of time watching Star Trek. Their response to "we need hot swap PCs in case of failures" was to ask us why we can't modify them to not fail or reroute around the problem. I can't just reverse the polarity of the hard drives, lady. If it dies, it dies. Reroute around the problem, sure. With a full set of hot spares and two-way KVM switches for everything that needs user input or output, that can be done. Good choice letting that one go. Too much potential trouble. Yes, but think of the LOLs we would get. Reminds me of an interview I had once, electronic test engineer position. I was shown a section of a circuit diagram, and asked to basically think aloud about it. So there's an op-amp, and there's a resistor in the supply line, and each side of the resistor was connected to the two inputs. I suggested that the resistor was probably for current monitoring, and therefore a fairly low value, and the thing was supposed to signal when the current hit a threshold or something. Okay, so why doesn't it work? Well, one of the inputs will be at a higher voltage than the supply, which isn't allowed. You need a couple of potential dividers, one each side of the resistor, and feed those into the op-amp instead. I didn't get the job, but I have a feeling I fixed their problem. Can I ask where in the world this was? It sounds a heap like a job I passed recently. It was in about 2006-7 in Ireland. Never have to answer to someone who doesn't understand basic stuff like that. My first boss told me that an interview is a two-way street. You are interviewing the company as much as the company is interviewing you. I'm pretty sure I got my first job because I asked to work here, as the vehicle gate from the visitor parking to the back lot had all sorts of caution sign on it. The manager just laughed and said, "You're the first one to ask about that." Was it? I'd be reporting to a guy, and getting paid less than a guy, who was less competent than myself. Lol. That's just called reporting to management. I sometimes get the manager who feels he has to figure out something he doesn't like and can change to justify his existence. I had a non-technical manager decide he didn't like the naming conventions I used in some code. It was some highly specialized stuff that I doubt would ever be touched after I finished with it. He insisted I change it all. I explained that it wasn't a quick search and replace because of the types of tools being used. But okay. Friday comes and I report that we got very little of the planned work for the week done. He fuming. I explained that I spent most of the week on his renaming order. Somehow it was my fault we were behind. I'm convinced that some interviews are to just help them solve problems that they aren't able to figure out on their own. I had the same issue at a previous interview. You know, I kinda wondered about that afterwards. Another reason why I refused a second interview. I felt like they just wanted some free tips. I had a painting company phone me a couple of years ago after I had advertised as a freelance drywall estimator. They said they were interested in hiring me as they intended to branch into drywall, but seemed more interested in details of how I price things than in me. I got really suspicious when they requested I send them some of my spreadsheets and documents to look over. I never sent them and cut off contact. They were just looking for free info. Kinda scummy to waste someone's time under false pretenses. No, it's extremely scummy. And, sadly, extremely common. I had a great one where I was interviewed for one side of this large company's data center team. But when talking about my experience, I was also senior level on this more obscure technology. So I was asked to talk to the head guy, one of the founders, about the obscure side. We got to talking and I like talking back and forth asking how they solve this one automated install issue. There isn't one. Being told about it, I thought out loud at other ways to speed it up. Trying to demonstrate I know the technology and can add value. After that interview was over, I was called back for another round on the first side where I started with. Well, the co-founder guy saw me in the lobby. Shortly after, I was escorted from the building by one of the senior people I already talked to. Being confused, I asked why and he did not know, but co-founder was mad. A few days later, I got the scoop that I pissed off the co-founder by questioning his automated install design and process. At least I got a good story from it, but I do miss what those stock options would have been worth now. You learned a life-changing lesson about egos that day. I think you made the right choice. Never settle for less than you're worth. Putting aside the IT aspect, why in the hell would someone in a business that has multiple single points of failure that can shut the entire business down not know to have ready spares to replace them? I mean, this is like common peeping sense. Well, take my production manager for example. He gets bonuses for coming in under budget. So not long after he started, he deferred buying spares till next month. and eventually stopped buying spares at all. Our weekly planned downtime for routine maintenance slashed. Fitter and electrician staff downsized. Thiep knows how he's cooking the books. But in this story it sounds like they had never even thought of having ready spares the way they reacted according to op. True, but my point was that common sense doesn't always dictate behavior. For all we know, the IT manager may have been pushing for hot spares but been stonewalled. I had a similar thing interviewing for the help desk of a small business. They were growing and their infrastructure was all shared drives on individual systems without a domain. They asked a couple questions about domain infrastructure and I talked about some of the changes and how they could get there. The owner looked at the head of IT and asked if my answers were good. The head of IT said domain systems were outside of his knowledge. I ended up not taking that job due to a low salary offer. Where I work, we had almost the opposite problem. The sole IT guy was almost entirely a networking guy. He knew networking and domains like the back of his hand, but couldn't do desktop support to save his life. Worked well for a while, as I have been sort of, not officially IT there for a decade. Desktop support I can do all day long, but it takes me about 5 seconds to get lost with networking. I was more than a little out of my depth when dude quit. Oh man, this was very similar to a job I left last summer after working for 6 months. I was in very similar situation as you. Got interviewed for similar position, except company was an analytical lab testing company that tests food, pharmaceutical and cannabis. The main IT person was an older person. I accepted the job as I had been out of work from being laid off a year and a half earlier and had been working Best Buy Geek Squad in the meantime. Was glad to get back into it work, but oh man, some similar scenarios you mention are some things I went through where basic troubleshooting common sense with current in-house IT wasn't present. Forward no nonsense thinking and getting folks back to work is how I like to get things done, but older person and parent company always were butting heads. I thought I'd learn a lot and also have more freedom and control as working with just one other person was a huge change from working on larger teams at previous companies I've worked at before. COVID hit and other guy was working from home until June and during that time there was so little for me to do that I started looking for other jobs that spring. Got another job, but soon left as I had issues with coworkers, management and other COVID related BS I didn't want to deal with.